can't just have any crackpot teaching a course, but those judgments should be based on scholarly quality, coherence, support by evidence, and not by content. I'm fully in favor of public expression of opinions, but that doesn't mean that I want someone invading my bedroom chanting, build the wall at 3 a.m. I mean, real dean, not the dean in charge of diversity, which is just a fancy schmancy way of conferring more prestige on a university.
Welcome to the Contrarian. I'm David Bernstein. In a world filled with noise, I'm here to provide the signal. Today we speak with one of my intellectual heroes, Professor Steven Pinker. Steven, thank you for being with us.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So I wanted to start, before we get into the nitty-gritty of how to change higher education, which I know you've written about and talked about and tweeted about recently. I want to ask you sort of a higher level conceptual question. You've written extensively, talked extensively about how conditions for the vast majority of humanity have improved in the past decades. And even if we have this sort of lingering perception that they've gotten worse, things have actually gotten better. But it seems to me that things have gotten worse in certain segments of society. Maybe one of them is higher education, where we've become more liberal in the past few decades. What is your sense of that?
Yeah, well, to say that things have gotten better doesn't mean that everything everywhere gets better for everyone all the time. I mean, that would be a miracle. That is not the way anything improves. So it can simultaneously be true that fewer people are starving to death, women are dying in childbirth, fewer children are dying before they become adolescents, more children are literate, more children are going to school, fewer people are killed in wars. Those are all facts, but it doesn't mean that we should be surprised if in some sector of some society somewhere, or in many sectors of many societies everywhere, some things are getting worse, because it's not, human progress is not a miraculous phenomenon or dialectic or process where miraculously everything gets better. It's the result of people trying to solve problems and every once in a while succeeding. So yeah, some things do get worse, and I think things have gotten worse on campuses, especially, I think there's been a worsening in just the last 5 years. But I think there was an opening up in the late 90s, early 2000s, but that quickly went into reverse.
So a few months ago, 3 college presidents went to Capitol Hill. They got grilled on Capitol Hill, and it seemed to be one of those pivotal moments in our discourse. I'm not sure exactly where it will lead, but I'm more hopeful today that there's been change unleashed in the realm of higher education. Shortly thereafter, you tweeted, I think, maybe that was the first I saw, a set of ideas on how to reform higher education. Could you talk about that and what your basic plan is?
Yeah, I articulated them in an article that published in our local paper, the Boston Globe, which they title A 5-Point Plan for Harvard to Save Itself. Although it doesn't only apply to Harvard, it's my employer, and I have no trouble biting the hand that feeds me, but it applies to universities across the board. Yeah, it was triggered by the disastrous performance of the 3 elite university presidents, who admittedly walked into a trap. This was political theater, but there were systemic problems in the universities that led them to these debacles. First, the university should reaffirm a commitment to academic freedom. That is, that people can't be censored or punished for considered opinions. Now, of course, all universities have to engage in quality control. You can't just have any crackpot teaching a course, but those judgments should be based on scholarly quality, coherence, support by evidence, and not by content. Now, that would have saved our former president, Claudine Gay, and the other presidents from a lot of tsouris, if you will, because what they said in response to the the leading question, if a student called for genocide of Jews, would they be punished by the university code of conduct, whatever that is? Technically speaking, the answers from the presidents were correct. Just as it isn't a crime to call for genocide in any jurisdiction of the United States because of the First Amendment. But the reason that the response came off as so outrageous is the universities had such a dismal record of protecting academic freedom. I mean, you could get into trouble for saying they're too sexist, but it's okay to call for the genocide of Jews. I mean, that's not exactly a ringing defense of the First Amendment principles or free speech absolutism. And so if there had been in place a clear and enforced commitment to academic freedom, then these kinds of outrageous hypotheticals wouldn't seem so galling. Second is that point that I called for is institutional neutrality. Within universities, these are sometimes called the Calvin principles, Calvin with a K, after a report from the University of Chicago in 1967, in the midst of the Vietnam War, which is that universities should shut up about the events of the day, about current controversies. Their professors and students should say what they want, but the university as an institution should be a neutral forum for the expression of ideas. The university president should not issue statements deploring this, that, or the other thing. Universities don't have to have a foreign policy or any policy, except for issues that directly concern them. If there's a case before the Supreme Court on university admissions and affirmative action, well, universities have skin in the game. They have a direct interest, and their insights are highly relevant. That's one thing. But when it comes to George Floyd, when it comes to Ukraine, when it comes to Israel and Gaza, the university president should shut up. And this, too, would have been a godsend to the university presidents, because, again, to refer to the one I know best, our former president, Claudine Gay, I mean, she got into trouble because her statement deploring the Hamas attack on Israel was a little too late. It wasn't strong enough. It was a little too both sidesy. And then there was a second statement, then a third statement. And, the more she denounced the attack, the more trouble she got into. Someone inevitably will be offended. So not only is it a sound principle for universities, but it would save them a lot of trouble. Third principle is nonviolence, that too often university administrations indulge students who think that it's a legitimate form of expression to occupy buildings and eject deans from their offices, to obstruct passageways, to invade classrooms chanting slogans over bullhorns. Even if you are a First Amendment advocate, there are legitimate restrictions on time, place, and manner of expression of speech. I'm fully in favor of public expression of opinions, but that doesn't mean that I want someone invading my bedroom chanting, build the wall at 3 a.m. There are legitimate grounds for preserving private spaces, and universities ought to have a consistent policy of not allowing students to shut down the university, invade classrooms, take over libraries, and so on. Again, this is it only works to their advantage, because if they, as they have been indulging violent student protesters, then they get sued for cracking down on this group and not cracking down on that group. There should just be the same enforcement of common sense laws on university campuses as there are in any other part of the country. Protesters may not invade my bedroom. It's my private space. They can carry a sign outside, but they also can't blare propaganda on a sound truck at 3 a.m. They can't set up their soapbox in the middle of a busy freeway. First Amendment doesn't protect those rights, and likewise, principles of academic freedom don't protect students' rights to use physical force to force other people to listen to their harangues. Fourth is viewpoint diversity. Now, this is the hardest to enforce because it depends on university culture, but as well as there being a increasing political monoculture in university campuses, where I think the last survey showed that 3% of Harvard faculty call themselves conservative. And I think those include people like Harvey Mansfield in his 90s, who is about to retire quite reasonably. So 3% is bound to go down. This is a problem, especially, of course, in departments of, say, government or political science and economics, but also in social science departments, where it can lead to quite obvious distortions of scholarship if there just isn't anyone within shouting distance who can say, hey, the questions in your questionnaire are highly misleading, your samples are misleading. But it isn't just the political left-right spectrum, but also the widespread enforcement of critical theory, intersectional, politically correct, woke, whatever you want to call it, that are just are ubiquitous, especially in certain departments. Now, if you believe in academic freedom, then of course you don't want the governor of the state to dictate who should be hired, but the process should somehow be opened up so that cliques of professors can't just hire like-minded professors. And there should be some recognition that of all the forms of diversity, intellectual, political, and viewpoint diversity are the most conducive to the fifth one is to disempower the so-called diversity, equity, and inclusion bureaucracy. And I've compared that to the Holy Roman Empire, which, as Voltaire said, is neither holy nor Roman nor an empire, and the diversity, equity, and inclusion bureaucracy and regulatory regime clamps down on diversity and equity and inclusion. By stealth, this bureaucracy has transformed university life in a way that was never openly discussed, never voted upon, it's very hard to find out which dean, real dean, not the dean in charge of diversity, which is just a fancy schmancy way of conferring more prestige on a university bureaucrat, but real deans, like the dean of arts and sciences, the provost, the president. No one ever kind of stepped forward and said, we're going to adopt these policies. They just got instituted by this bureaucracy, and often the faculty have to dig around to find out what the policies are. Now, I don't believe that faculty should run the university for obvious reasons of conflict of interest, but nor should these kind of unelected bureaucrats. I'll give you an example, and then I will stop talking, I promise. At Harvard, we were curious as to whether our job applicants and promotion candidates had to write these so-called diversity statements, where they basically have to declare allegiance to principles of critical social justice, intersectionality, and so on, and that are a rather pernicious way of weeding out even ordinary liberals, let alone conservatives, from the university professoriate, and therefore locking in this ideology for generations to come. And we discovered that actually Harvard does require them. At least the Faculty of Arts and Sciences does. They don't require departments to read them, but they require applicants to submit them. This came as, when I say us, by the way, I mean the Council on Academic Freedom at Harvard. And no one can remember faculty voting on them or even any dean announcing this is the policy going forward. It was just there. This cadre of bureaucrats moves kind of laterally from university to university, so they're pretty much independent of civilian control, like civilian control of the military. I don't think necessarily we should abolish all of their policies, but they should be made public. They should be defended, and those that where the defense is untenable should be eliminated. But they shouldn't take over the university by bureaucratic stealth. Okay, that's 5.
So on that last point on very well stated. Thank you. On that last point, DEI, that's obviously come under greater scrutiny in the last couple of months. A colleague of yours, Danielle Allen, she's a political philosopher at Harvard, African-American woman, wrote a piece in the Washington Post maybe a month or so ago, talking about how she was part of a task force, I think it was a 4-person task force, to create a open, liberal, pluralistic form of DEI at Harvard that would include both viewpoint diversity and religious diversity in the mix. And if you include viewpoint diversity at the very least, you're going to change the very nature of DEI. It's not going to be as ideological. It's not going to divide the world neatly into oppressed and oppressors. Now you're welcoming, if you take it seriously at least, multiple points of view about even the hardest questions facing our society. Why is there disparity? That got nixed in the wake of George Floyd. And I'm wondering if there's any real prospect for reforming DEI in higher education. You know, I'd be okay with a reformed, pluralistic, open, thoughtful DEI, if you even want to call it DEI at that point, because it wouldn't be imposing a single ideology on the entire campus community. But I'm not sure it's possible. You know, University of Michigan for example, has a $30 million DEI program a year. How do you take a bureaucracy like this gargantuan bureaucracy, and turn it into something different from itself? It seems to be almost an impossible task. What are your thoughts? Can it be reformed, or does it have to be sort of? Someone said, "Don't throw away with the baby with the bathwater," but I'm not sure that you can. I think you might have to empty the bath in order to refill it. What are your thoughts?
Yes, it's not clear what the baby is there. Right. In terms of institutional change, what leads entrenched bureaucracies with some degree of support among faculty, how institutions reform themselves might be a topic for someone who studies institutional reform. I don't know. Now, it's possible, often when there are budgetary crises and something must get cut, this would be a natural candidate under the guise of just balancing the budget. But in practice, instead what they do is they cut out academic departments, but so far the diversity bureaucracy always emerges unscathed. That may change. And of course, there are tremendous financial pressures on universities as the college-age population shrinks and as the public's indulgence of state support for especially state universities starts to wear thin.
Yes. And your, I think, fourth point, it might have been, you sort of stated in passing that we don't want state governments to come in and impose change or impose something different. And this brings us to, one of our most divisive cultural figures these days, Chris Rufo, and his work to try to shift campus culture. And while I'm probably much more aligned with you on these questions than with Chris Rufo. But I have to say, as somebody who's been in the world of politics all my life, I don't think it's just, as he would put it, op-eds and good papers and sound analysis and that are going to bring about change. It might require some a politics of change that is forced from the outside that gives a jolt to the university. Now, I don't want that to lead to an alternative form of a liberalism that would be, I think someone quipped, I don't want it to lead ultimately to the Mike Pence kindergarten program, but I would like there to be change. And I know that change sometimes requires, brute force. It's not always a scalpel. It can be a hammer or sledgehammer even. And I'm wondering about that. Like, when you hear, for example, that Oklahoma has issued an the governor of Oklahoma issued an executive order to do away with its DEI program. Do you find that problematic?
Yeah, let's see. So for a state university where the state is supported by the taxpayers, it's there to fulfill a mission for the public interest. I probably differ from many of my faculty colleagues who actually equate academic freedom with professorial privilege. That is, anything that gets in the way of professors' rights to do what they want is a threat to academic freedom. I think that the state has a legitimate interest to some say in the way that public universities are run. But you want it done so that we don't have, Ron DeSantis University. Ideally, and again, it's not trivial to reform entrenched legacy institutions. Ideally, it would not be dictating content, but changing the process so that the governance is open, really diverse viewpoints, and transparency, so that policies are stated and defended, and therefore the indefensible ones would wither. Now, I think we're entering uncharted territory when it comes to governance. And by the way, that's a whole other issue that I didn't talk about in my 5-point plan, but which has become far more salient given all the conspicuous failures of governance. Again, not to be too parochial, but Harvard is the kind of the brand name university that everyone pays attention to. But those strange ways that universities are governed, like who ultimately is in charge, who hires and fires the president, what kind of guidance does the president get? And then, of course, within the university, who or what empowers departments in their faculty positions, how they hire them, how they promote. I think it would be valuable to open those processes up in a way that these hammerlocks on appointments that just entrench ideologies are loosened. Now, how to do that would probably require someone with more expertise in the governance of institutions than I have, but I do think it should be opened up. And I'm not perhaps that in the whole ecosystem of colleges and universities, having a few in the mix that are more directly under the control of state legislatures, maybe that would be fine in terms of diversity of approaches. See how that works out, but prima facie, it doesn't seem to be the solution to the problem, which would seem to be just opening up more transparency, more diversity, more accountability. So even if the governor doesn't pick the deans, the governor and the taxpayer should see how the deans are picked and have at least some kind of input into how their dollars are spent and what kind of privilege, what the society gets back in exchange for the various privileges it grants universities.
Sort of, you mentioned this, the doctrine of academic freedom, and I want to sort of play out a case study with you. A new institute was set up through the University of California, Santa Cruz, called the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism. And if you look at what materials they put out, it's not critical in the way we would talk about critical. It's critical in that sort of critical social justice sense of seeing systems of oppression. And it's really a monolithic conversation about Zionism, about anti-Zionism, really. And a center of this university, it's a Center for Racial Justice. I'm probably not getting the exact name right, but it's a center that has racial justice in its name. You look at has sort of advocated for this new institute to spread around the United States. And I started to look into this institute, and it's also that Center for Racial Justice, and realize that it really it's a closed system. It's a closed conversation. It would be very hard for a liberally minded student to go and take courses at that center and be able to say something that's not fully in sync with the professor. I would imagine almost impossible. That's now. I'm wondering what we do about that. It seems to me that that's the juggernaut. Could a university, if its governance decided, if the governors decided, institute new procedures that would audit classes, not for what the professor's opinion was. The professor can say what they want, but to make sure that professors actually showed a variety of perspectives in every class, that critical thinking was actually happening in a humanities class. And would that be a violation of academic freedom, or would that be sort of an advancement of academic freedom if we had processes like that in place?
Yeah, it's a good question, and one that I and my colleagues on the Council on Academic Freedom have been grappling with. Clearly, there's something wrong with the status quo. How you change the status quo is a little less clear. But audits not for content. Professors should be able to say what they want, but they shouldn't be able to shut students up if students want to say what they want. And again, within the bounds of basic standards of scholarly quality, you don't necessarily have to indulge an astrologer or a young Earth creationist in a biology class, but for there to be some kind of enforcement on, say, students' rights to express contrary opinions, we don't have a mechanism that prevents students' academic freedom. And nor do we have a mechanism to protect the academic freedom of heterodox thinkers within particular disciplines. So it is clearly an abuse, and something has gone seriously wrong if there's basically an anti-Zionism center funded at taxpayer expense. In the same way as if there was an Ayn Rand institute on campus, or a communist institute, or a Catholic political lobbying institute. That's sort of not what universities should be about. Although, of course, any of those subject matters would be appropriate, as long as whatever academic units are dedicated to studying them allow for disagreement, debate, diversity of opinion. So those at least should be principles that everyone agrees to. They should be out there so that when this is the minimal standard. Now, that is, it should be common knowledge that all units within a university ought to be dedicated to intellectual diversity, to freedom of expression of opinion, so that at least if someone sets up an institute that's obviously a propaganda organ, its opponents have something they can point to on the books of the university to oppose it. Better, but that may not be enough. There might have to be some mechanism that makes sure that propaganda organs don't become institutes of universities, especially those that are state universities. Now, if there's a private, evangelical university, a private, Catholic university, a Jesuit university, a yeshiva university, then, as private entities, they have the right to do what they want. Although if they want to compete for prestige and students and funding, then if they themselves are just house organs for some advocacy group, they will suffer in that competition. But at least for public universities, there ought to be some mechanism that prevents this kind of abuse.
So you mentioned the hiring and promotion process at universities and the problematic nature of DEI statements and the like. And you talked about Harvard probably having 3% of its faculty conservative. I don't know how many would regard themselves as sort of rational liberals or somewhere in that, but I would imagine it's a shrinking percentage of the professoriate. And I'm wondering if we need something akin to a viewpoint affirmative action, which sounds illiberal on the face of it, but how do you actually overcome that if you don't make a concerted effort to higher ideological diversity? It sounds very much like actually the problem we had maybe going back into the 50s and 60s when we had almost no black or women professors and we would have to do something proactive to hire them. Are we now saying we need viewpoint affirmative action?
Yeah, so that does come up, and it's a good question. It might be that rather than quotas and set-asides, as in the racial domain, which long ago were ruled unconstitutional, we don't want a conservative slot or a monetarist slot or a Ayn Rand slot or a Catholic slot. But there should certainly be the value of intellectual diversity, and perhaps as in the kind of thumb on the scale type of affirmative action, where if there are two candidates that are equally qualified, you tip it over to the minority candidate or to the woman, just because it's not a bad thing to make sure that your faculty isn't all male or all white. That kind of mindset should, in fact, even more so apply to intellectual diversity. That is, there should be a premium put on someone who doesn't think exactly the same way as everyone else in that department. That's kind of a soft, not a quota, but a recognition of it as a value in a university. Well, what I was going to say is that the universities already have a mechanism that is kind of designed to do that. Departments have visiting committees where every 6 years or so, a group of mix of sometimes of academics and donors and other people visit the department and kind of appraise it in terms of its overall quality and needs. And in theory, they should say, hey, this has become a political clack when that happens. in practice, they tend to be friends of the department. There's some cronyism, and they tend to be advocates of the department, going to the dean saying, hey, the psychology department needs money for a scanner, or needs more support for its grad students, which of course we appreciate, but that mechanism, which at least is already in place, so it would require no institutional reform, but I think they should be given more responsibility and a mandate by the deans that appoint them to check out the intellectual diversity of the departments that they nominally oversee.
Yeah, so I started to mention Elizabeth Weiss, whom you know as well. She's an anthropology professor who has written about why she thinks it's wrong that we repatriate indigenous Native American artifacts and the like, which is a very controversial issue. I learned in her circles, her academic circles. What was remarkable to me was to watch how monolithic her colleagues had become, and how the sheer desire to sort of purge her from their ranks for not going along with the dominant view. And it's hard for me to understand how departments like that that become so homogenous in nature would change if not for sort of a brute external force pushing them to do so. And I don't know. I'm trying to imagine, like, bureaucracies are very stubborn creatures. Yeah. How do you get a bureaucracy that is so set in its ways to change without really giving it a jolt, or even disbanding it in some cases?
Yes, Upton Sinclair said it's very hard to get a man to understand something when his livelihood depends on not understanding it, or woman. Of course, naturally, the bureaucrats themselves have no interest in anything changing, but the professors there, it's not so clear that it's self-interest, because they could keep their jobs even if they had colleagues who disagreed with them. Maybe it'd be a nuisance to have to defend yourself against someone who argues against you, but that's kind of what you sign on to if you become an academic. But there is a phenomenon, and I can't resist slipping back into my professional role as a psychologist. Namely, there's a phenomenon of secular taboo. That is, ideas that are considered immoral to think. It's we associate it with Polynesian superstitions, but there are many modern Western equivalents, and you can see where this mindset originates. There's some cases in which we really don't want to think certain thoughts. Someone said, "How much money would you take to, sell your wife?" The answer is, well, not, how much are you offering? It's like, I am offended that you asked that question, and I refuse to think about it.
Right.
Now that's where the notion of taboo, the phenomenon of taboo comes from, that we demonstrate our moral commitments by what we are not willing to consider. Now, the thing is, if you're in the business of scholarship, there really should be few or no taboos. It's an illegitimate carryover of our commitments to personal relationships if we apply that to intellectual life and say some questions that ought to be on the table. If you are a thinker, a scholar, an academic, a scientist, you're an evil person if you even think that thought. And it's, I think, a constant pushback against a feature of human nature to say that it's the job of scholars to circumvent taboos, at least most of the time. But what's happened in archaeology and anthropology is a case where, and what Elizabeth Weiss ran into, is that this was not considered a legitimate matter of debate. That is, if you were a good person, you don't question it, and that does run counter to the very basis of scholarship, intellectual life, that you don't go with social genteelness, but you question whatever needs to be questioned.
Yeah. It makes me wonder if what we're seeing is sort of a cultural phenomena that's meant to sort of lift up a certain kind of personality archetype and hold down others. For example, the thinker rationalist archetype has sort of been fallen in disfavor compared to somebody who's very relational in nature. And we built a culture around that human cultural, that archetype. And I'm probably not using the language that you use in psychological or social psychological circles, but it seems to me that some of that has happened, that's the kind of cultural shift we've been seeing recently.
Yeah, I think that's right. That there's and in many ways, liberal philosophy, science, free inquiry, open-ended journalism, they all kind of run counter to human nature. And I say this as someone whose business it is to try to characterize human nature, but that is the very idea that you can ascertain the truth about cosmic issues like the origin of life, the causes of fortune and misfortune, the machinations of power, the deep history, the microscopic, the cosmological. The very idea that you can actually know something about these is just a gift of the Enlightenment and of liberalization of the last 100, 150 years. For the vast majority of human existence, I mean, how could you know how old the universe is? 13 billion years. How could someone even 200 years ago have guessed that, let alone 2,000 or 20,000 years ago? And I think the human mind just doesn't naturally think that questions outside our immediate existence, what we can actually see with our own eyes or hear about through the eyewitness testimony of other humans, that there is a fact of the matter, that there's a truth, and that the whole point of science, academia, journalism, record keeping is to ascertain that truth. Instead, we fall back on, I think, a much more natural way of thinking, which is that these are in the proper realm of mythology, of fables, of morally uplifting heroic tales, that what you ought to believe is what is morally salubrious, healthy. Now, this runs directly counter against the whole point of academia, science, scholarship, journalism, which is we should relentlessly pursue the truth by whatever ingenious means we can come up with. We shouldn't believe things because they're comforting. We shouldn't believe things because we think they have the right moral of the story. We should believe things because they're true. But that whole mindset is really alien to human nature, and I think it has to constantly be reinforced. And I think what we're seeing in academia is kind of a pushback against what ought to have been the best of academia. Namely, we can discover truths about things that are pretty unintuitive, that don't seem like there is a truth to be found, but we'll use our collective ingenuity to find it. But it's very easy to fall back on there are good coalitions and bad coalitions, and good beliefs and bad beliefs, and what we ought to do is reinforce what is morally sacred.
So one last question, and if you will, and this requires us to descend the ladder of abstraction a bit to back into sort of structural reform. This was not in your 5 points, but it's one that I've been talking to others about, and it's creating sort of alternative models of higher education. One, we see the University of Austin, Texas, which is out now and seems to have actually done quite well in a very short period of time. It seems to be thriving. A second model that I've seen are what sometimes are called centers for civic thought. This is an alternative model of open inquiry within an existing university that is allowed to be open. I mean, you would think the whole university campus should be that way, but obviously that's not the case. So you're creating an alternative model that theoretically over time would compete against the more ideologically entrenched academic departments, might attract the better professoriate talent and student talent, and then eclipse them really and change the university culture in the process. At the very least, it would allow some of the best and brightest and most open-minded students to have a place to study without being indoctrinated. So that's another thing. And I think Yale Law School is starting to one, and I think we're seeing one at University of North Carolina. And there's about 7 or 8 of them out there. We're looking at them and trying to understand how they're functioning. But it seems to me that's a good way forward. And the third thing that I've heard people argue for is like finding maybe a dozen or so colleges or universities that perhaps don't have multi-billion-dollar endowments and might be struggling, and getting philanthropists together and others together and really investing in those places on condition that they adopt liberal academic principles and that they become centers of academic openness themselves. Those are the three structural alternatives that I've seen. What do you think of those?
So, in general, I'm in favor of that, of competition, of alternative models. There are some pitfalls, and the University of Austin, which I think I think it had a rocky opening. It seems to be getting on track, and I'm cheering them on. Mm-hmm. But there's a danger in doing that, of setting up, unwoke university with the faculty of the canceled. That if you're just rounding up, if you confuse the goal of finding a lifeboat for faculty who've been canceled, and if your philosophy is we're not going to be woke, we're not going to be leftist, that's not a coherent basis for education in the 21st century. Among other things, unless you've got good, rigorous education in scientific ideas, in probability, in probabilistic thinking, in understanding things like evolution and thermodynamics and game theory, I think you're not an educated person. And I think if you're going to rethink education, it can't just be, we're not going to be woke. So that is one pitfall that I think these startups are in danger of falling into. You can't have as your only scientist, for example, someone who's just an across-the-board contrarian, who's anti-vaccine and anti-fluoridation and likes ivermectin because politically correct Anthony Fauci is against it. It's got to be the best possible science and the most coherent rethinking of what a university education ought to be in the 21st century. So it can't be reactionary, just say we're not going to do what they do. Now, for institutes of critical thinking, intellectual freedom, intellectual vitality, we have one in Harvard, an intellectual vitality initiative. It's very easy for universities to accept money. They love money. And if a donor says, I'm going to give you hundreds of millions of dollars to found a new initiative, deans will say, great, hundreds of millions of dollars. But a program for intellectual vitality, or an institute for independent thinking or free inquiry, reminds me of the old Jewish joke of two men going into a Lower East Side restaurant. The waiter comes over and says, what will it be, gentlemen? And one man says, I'd like a glass of tea, please. The other says, I'd like a glass of tea too, and make sure the glass is clean. So the waiter comes back, he says, two glasses, and which one asked for the clean glass? It's kind of missing the point. If you've got a Institute of Intellectual Vitality, what is the rest of the university? Intellectual stagnation and stultification. If you have a center for free inquiry, does that mean the rest of the university can go ahead and be Institute of Censorship? So, maybe it will be a beachhead that will then expand. Maybe by example, it'll show what can be done. But to kind of ghettoize free inquiry and intellectual vitality and so on, does have a problematic aspect. Maybe that's the best that we could hope for in these big aircraft carriers that can't easily be steered. And then startups or revitalizations, maybe with the help of liberal-minded philanthropists and donors, is also not a bad idea. If it's done not as a rebound, as a reaction, as an woke, but as a real rethinking of what universities are for, because there are many, many aspects of the running of modern elite universities that just haven't been rethought in decades and should be opened up. So as long as it's done in that spirit, rather than whatever universities are doing will do the exact opposite, then I think it's hopeful.
Mr. Pinker, thank you so much for your insights. Thank you for fighting the good fight at your own university and also being a national voice at this very pivotal moment in higher education, and I think for the larger society as well. What happens in higher education, clearly, as we've learned, never stays in higher education. And I'm so thankful to have your compelling voice out there at this time.
My pleasure, and thank you for the work that you do. very also valuable and indispensable.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to The Contrarian. If you enjoyed the show, be sure to give us a thumbs up and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Don't forget to rate our podcast on Apple and Spotify. Stay connected with us on social media for more updates. Until next time, keep challenging.